Thank you, Felipe. What I'm discussing today is modern folklore about the origins of writing, in which the existence of a new script is explained through narratives of revelation or recuperation. In other words, writing is seen to arrive into a recently literate community by means of a vision, or it's understood to have been lost long ago in the distant past, but then restored in the present through a miraculous process. I'm going to argue that the cross-cultural regularity of these narratives is an effect of shared political, social, and perhaps cognitive experiences of literacy. And then I'm going to use these reflections to cautiously suggest some ways we could think about cultural attitudes to writing as a technology in more ancient contexts. Traditional narratives are wonderful for anthropologists because you get a kind of unvarnished representation of values, worldviews, ontologies, etc., in the words of participants in that practice or in that society. And no matter how wild these narratives might be, you have to look them in the face, and I think you have to take them seriously as representations. Writing as a technology has been around for about 5,000 years, as you all know well, but global literacy rates didn't rise beyond 50% until the 1970s. So today, if you are a non-literate adult, people want to know why, what's gone wrong. But not long ago, being literate was the unusual status that required explanation. Literacy for most of human history has been highly restricted. Now, I'm very interested in the past 200 years or so. This is, I guess, the historical window in which writing has spread rapidly across the globe, largely on the back of colonial expansions with impetus from state-supported ideologies, often religious. And this modern period is also where we see the contraction of empires, at least politically. But empires leave things behind. Literacy is one of those things, and now it's hegemonic. Most people in most places acquire some level of literacy in some kind of writing system. All this is important context, but I'm less interested in the historical vectors of literacy or the rise of literacy, and much more interested in how non-literate or recently literate communities have reacted to the introduction of writing. How does writing get incorporated into existing cultural practices, including other material symbolic systems? How is it reimagined? Many of these smaller communities adopted the writing systems introduced by colonial powers, either by force or by choice. Some actively rejected writing, but others decided they wanted to reinvent writing on their own terms and for their own ends. And these reinventions are the examples I'm discussing today. I've been doing this work in different ways for a while now. I spent a lot of time with the Eskaya community of the Philippines. This is a community that created its own writing system about a century ago, and also a completely new spoken language as well. But the writing came first. And they developed, you can see there, a manuscript and folklore tradition that, among other things, accounts for the creation of their writing and purports to establish a much deeper chronology for it than 100 years. So I wanted to understand, from an insider's point of view, what motivated the creation of the writing system and why has it been so successful? What is the writing system doing other than simply representing language? And subsequent to this, I've been interested in similar situations elsewhere in Southeast Asia. That's Highland Southeast Asia and the Pacific. I've sort of tried to cram Asia and the Pacific onto that slide, and then over in West Africa. But this research has been much more archives-based, with not very much original fieldwork on my part. So in my data set of new writing systems, I've got about 120 of these examples of secondary scripts created in the past 2 centuries within small-scale communities in the wake of colonial contact. Not just in West Africa, Southeast Asia and the Pacific, but this is just, there's a bias in those regions because that's where I've been looking. Sometimes the documentation for these secondary scripts is really good. Much of the time we have only scraps of information. At the broadest scale, I've been trying to get a snapshot of what's going on against various parameters. So are they alphabet syllabaries, alpha syllabaries? What are the phonological structures of the of the languages they model, what are their influences, what are their unique historical circumstances, and how are they actually used? Are their uses restricted to ritual and scripture, for example, or are they used in much more mundane ways, perhaps for keeping records or writing letters? And even at this scale, there's a great deal of diversity in the dataset. I have traditional origin stories for only about a third of these 120 odd examples, and yet it's here that we find, I think, less diversity. I think there are some genuine patterns that prevail in how people historicise their new scripts. Very often the new writing system is said to be received in a vision or a dream, and I'm calling these revelation narratives. Another common story is that the new writing system is not new at all. Its origins are in some deep primordial past. It became lost, and now it's being recovered, and I call these recuperation narratives. In a few cases, both narratives coexist. The writing system was lost in the ancient past, but then retransmitted through the medium of a dream or vision in the present. Okay, I'm not the first to notice the dream motif. It's something that sometimes gets discussed in the literature, and I might come back to that. Now I want to return to these maps that I showed earlier, and I want to highlight where we get these different kinds of stories. So here we have, and everywhere highlighted in pale blue is where we have revelation narratives. And where there's blue and green, that's where we get combined revelation and recuperation narratives. So that, just looking at that, that's quite a number, quite a significant number of dream stories with quite a large geographic range and historical span from the 1830s to the 2000s. But I don't think there's anything we can infer from the distribution, given that we're dealing with incomplete data. This is just to try and give you a bit of a view from space, if you like. Let's look at the Asia Pacific. So yeah, again, quite a lot of revelation narratives, a few more recuperation narratives, and a few that are combined, and more of the straight-up recuperation narratives than we've got in West Africa. So I'm now going to zoom in on a few examples to illustrate these kinds of narratives. I promise I'm not going to talk about all of them. Okay, so only a handful are based on my own fieldwork. I've only done fieldwork on Skaya, Ottomang, and Abakano. But what I noticed from the doing fieldwork, is that people might hold a range of attitudes towards these stories. They might believe in their literal truth. They might be sceptical, and very often there are generational differences in what gets emphasised in a narrative. And the most disconcerting experience for me is for when people ask me what I think is the truth, as if, my opinion is as valid as anyone else's, and then I have to be evasive. So I'm going to start with the Vai script of Liberia. Okay, so it's not only the earliest example of a secondary script on the continent of Africa, it also happens to be really well documented. The script was invented by a group of non-literate men, and it originated in the context of the founding of the nation of Liberia, ongoing conflicts over transatlantic enslavement, and the emergence of new kinds of colonialism and new forms of political power. So here's the story. In about 1834, Mamu Dualu Bukele had a dream in which he was visited by a tall white stranger who said he'd been sent by other white men to bring him a book. He warned that the book could only be touched by those who respected certain taboos. The visitor showed Bukele the book and taught him how to write words in the Vai language using its script. When Bukele awoke, he couldn't remember the signs or their values. Afterwards, he and his cousins collaborated to devise the Vai script. One of the cousins later had a dream in which the white man returned, telling him that the book had come from God. So when I put things in red, those are just little things that appeal to me, that I'm drawing attention to, and I'll come back to some of them. The full origin story is much more elaborate than this. I've just tried to kind of condense it. Okay. So there we've got a classic revelation narrative. This is the Avoyuli script of Vanuatu from 1980s. Chief Ireleo studied the traditional Vanuatu practice of making stylized sand drawings. Through contemplation, he arrived at the realization that the drawings were actually an ancient pre-colonial alphabet that could be used to write the Raga language. So there you can see the relationship between the sand drawings and the script. And Chief Ireleo is still alive, and I understand from Daniel that he's been in prison and he's free again. Okay. So now we're in Malaysian Borneo. The ancestor Rengi tried to rescue the Iban alphabet from a giant flood by securing the script to his loincloth. He scaled a tree, but the rising waters soaked the alphabet, which disappeared into the current. Rengi took the skin of the wood that had contained the script and swallowed it. For this reason, it is believed that Rengi's descendants were able to memorize knowledge easily, as if they had read it. Between 1947 and 1962, a descendant of Rengi by the name of Dunging Anak Gungu slowly recovered the lost Iban alphabet of his forefather. Okay, so nice recuperation story there. Now we're in what was Burma, now Myanmar. After years of illness, Pao Chin Hao experienced a series of dreams and visions in 1900. One was of a rope ascending to heaven which nobody could climb, but Pao Chin Hao succeeded after he knelt in prayer. Later he dreamed of Western inventions that had not yet reached Burma, including railway trains and steamships. He dreamed of terrible global battles that left his own people covered in rubbish and dust. He could not look away as an Englishman showed him these scenes in a mirror that he was holding towards him. Finally, in 1902, he had a dream in which the same Englishman was understood to be divine. He taught Pao Chin Hao how to read and write using stones in the shapes of letters which formed a book. When he awoke, he wrote the shapes down and began devising the writing system, which was not completed until 1931. Okay, Pao Chin Hao also, I believe, not literate when he created this script. And it went through several phases. Now we're in this, I don't think this one was actually on my map because it's down in the Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo. In 1978, Wabaladio Payi had a dream in which a voice commanded him to go to the holy city in order to pray, bathe himself in sacred waters, and prepare to be given a mission to help African people. On the journey, there were several miracles. The final miracle was a vision of a flying man who Wabaladio hoped would be the messenger to deliver his sacred mission. Back at home, he prayed for 8 months. At the end of the 8th month, he realised that the mortar between the bricks on the wall of his room made the repeated shape of a 5 and a 2. He drew these shapes on paper. That night, he dreamed that an insect inscribed these signs on his shirt with its saliva. Then he had a second dream in which the prophet, Simon Kimbangu, told him that the signs were the beginning of a material work. When he awoke, he puzzled over the signs, writing them out again and again, and trying to develop them further. Much later, he worked it into a writing system and understood that this was the mission he'd been called for. Okay, it's a really beautiful writing system. I love this one. It also has elements similar to Hangul in that it divides, each block is single syllable, but then the syllable blocks subdivide into kind of alphabetic components, which is quite cool. I might skip over this one. It's another recuperation narrative of a lost book. Oh, it's combined. There's a vision as well, and this one goes back to the 1840s, also in Myanmar. Okay, famous Bamun script. One night, King Ibrahim Najoya had a dream in which a man came to him and said, "King, take a board and draw a man's hand. Wash what you have drawn and drink." The king took the board and drew a man's hand as instructed. Then he passed the board to the man who wrote on it and gave it back to the king. There were a lot of people sitting there. They were all pupils with writing boards in their hands, which they again gave to their brothers. The next day, the king took a board and drew a man's hand. He washed the board and drank the water that had been used to wash it, as he had been told in the dream. The king called many people and said to them, "If you draw many different things and name them, I will make a book that will speak without being heard." Okay. All right, and this is one that I've worked on, the Iskaya script of the Philippines. The ancestor Pinay was instructed by the Holy Child to create a writing system and base it on the human body. The writing system was then used throughout the island of Bohol until the Spanish came and burned all the Boholano manuscripts, suppressing both the language and the script. Later in the early 20th century, the prophet Mariano de Tahan rediscovered wooden tablets written in the script that had been hidden from the Spanish. He decoded these tablets to learn the lost language and script of Pinay and then retransmitted it to his followers. In an alternative version, de Tahan received a vision of the language and script from the ancestral past. I should mention there are multiple versions. Another one where de Tahan is understood as a reincarnation of Pinay, or Pinay never died, and that was Mariano de Tahan, and so on. Okay. So, where am I up to? So those are 8 examples. I've got 21 or 2 more of these kinds of revelation and recuperation narratives. So it's hard to choose which ones to use as illustrations. But my idealisation of a revelation narrative would go something like this. The hero has a dream or vision in which a politically or spiritually powerful stranger brings the gift of writing. The writing is distinctive and is seen to belong exclusively to the language of the hero's community, even though it has come from the outside. After the vision, the hero is inspired and authorised to create a new writing system alone or in collaboration with others. And here's how I would condense a recuperation narrative. The people were once powerful and culturally self-confident. They became weak and outsiders were able to destroy their cultural patrimony, including their writing system. Finally, the hero recovers the writing system. And these could also be combined as well. So a few other motifs that I notice. In several of the cases, there is reference to periods of seclusion on the part of the creator or periods of unexplained illness prior to the vision or recuperation. There is a motif of vocation or being called by a higher power so that divine agency is placed in the hands of a human creator. The supernatural entity doesn't say, here's a fully formed gift, use it wisely, go for it. The individual is often on their own. And what's revealed or gifted or recovered is a kind of embryonic idea of writing. It's not like a light bulb moment. The inventors then go on to slowly develop their writing over a period of years. So Eskayan from 1920 to 1937, Pawamong from 1959 to 1971, Mandombe from 1978 to the 1990s. And Ramon Sarro's recent book on Mandombe really shows how slow and careful the process was, even though it began in a vision of literally the writing on the wall. That was just the beginning. The process happens afterwards. We get descriptions of taboos that are associated with a script. And I should point out that these writing systems end up as part of the ritual paraphernalia of new politico-religious movements in a number of cases, especially in Southeast Asia, often with aspirations to statehood and independence. This is less so in West Africa. Often the stories associate writing with other introduced technologies, with Pouching how it's steamships and railroads and perhaps mirrors. In other stories, it's sickles, bridle bits, electric light. There are themes of inspiration from natural phenomena, leaves, stones, insect trails, bird tracks. And lastly, embodiment is a bit of a theme, eating or drinking a script or having it incorporated into the body in some way. All right, so what's going on? Why revelation and recuperation? I'm not going to hit you with any groundbreaking insights. I don't have an elegant theory that explains everything, but I do have thoughts, and I'm going to talk about cultural inheritance, colonial contact dynamics, transmission dynamics, and psychological experiences, all very briefly. So when it comes to explanations for a pattern, we have to consider, is this a cross-cultural reality or are there historical determinants? Or both. In West Africa, you have to take into account the overwhelming influence of Christianity and Islam, two scriptural religions that emphasize vision and revelation in connection with writing. Revelation is strongly associated with writing in the Quran, and we also get this in the Old Testament. In terms of cultural inheritance, I want to mention traditions in West Africa in which knowledge is received in a trance state. So we can think about visions in that way. And there are also in Muslim or Muslim-influenced communities rituals of inscribing surahs from the Quran onto wooden tablets, washing off the ink and ingesting the fluid for healing purposes. And the writing is understood to have a sacred property and to be read by the body. And this exists in West Africa, but also all the way over to the east into Tanzania and elsewhere. And in a few of these revelation stories, this ritual comes up in the vision, as we saw with Bamon. And also for the Metaphydraan script of Nigeria, there's the same story. And this last one is actually from a Christian community, which is interesting, or similar story at least. And in Southeast Asia, all these inventions happen in highland communities that have historical experiences of colonisation by encroaching lowland states, by the Han Chinese, the Burmese, the Vietnamese, even before the interference from European empires. So such is the shared historical and cultural context, perhaps, which brings me now to colonial contact dynamics. So all of these communities came into abrupt and often violent contact with threatening literate outsiders. In these situations, writing was understood to be both foreign and a source of power, religious power as much as political power. This is absolutely a common experience. It's a circumstance that encourages a kind of emergent third way politics. Neither the old ways nor the new foreign ways are going to save us in this uncertain situation, and the individuals who succeed are the ones who can demonstrate a capacity to channel the power of tradition and also the power and technology of the foreigners. So this kind of dynamic is heavily theorised in anthropology. But it doesn't necessarily explain writing systems created in the post-colonial period or even in the 2010s, where we still get revelation and recuperation narratives. There we go. One thing that is occasionally suggested in the literature is that it's hard to, I'll move on to transmission, it's hard to ensure the success of a brilliant and transformative idea if you want to take credit for it. In the contemporary West, there's a sense that we value or pretend to value innovation, novelty, experimentation, the individual who thinks outside of the box, the genius. In other societies, what might be foregrounded is faithful adherence to tradition, veneration of ancestors, or group effort and collective action. I'm being reductive because you can find any of these values in any society. But you can see perhaps how a vision or a recuperation situates authority elsewhere, empowers the individual to introduce a change that they don't have to take credit for, and it gives others a motivation to perpetuate it. By arms race here, what I mean is that if you see your next door neighbours adopting a new script and deriving benefit from it, it's not just a source of inspiration, but a precedent that gives you cultural cover for trying something new. This is certainly what happened, I think, in West Africa. The Vai script was very influential, and neighbours of the Vai knew the origin story associated with the script, so perhaps there's a bit of a founder effect here. And finally, what Stephen earlier was talking about in terms of contrast scripts and scripts in rupture, think about when a community creates a writing system and tries to make it as different as possible from their neighbours, or they modify an existing system in order to have another mechanism for ethnic, linguistic and political differentiation. And perhaps revelation and recuperation narratives can set up a blank slate or a kind of a year zero that justifies and energises this differentiation. Okay, this is very speculative, but I just wanted to find a place for it somewhere. When you learn a new script as an adult, at least from my own experience, you get these moments of wonder where what first looked like arbitrary, inscrutable marks on a page, they kind of coalesce in your mind in this gestalt moment where the linguistic value of the sign sort of leaps out at you. You hear it in your head whether you want to or not. It's wonderful. It feels kind of mysterious and exciting. And I would expect perhaps this is the same for adult non-literates learning their first writing system. So I'm just wondering if in some of these stories we get retellings of that kind of experience, contemplating the bricks or the stones or the sand and receiving an unbidden linguistic message. Sequoia, who invented the Cherokee script in Georgia, also talked about contemplating patterns before he invented that script, though he himself didn't have a vision. He insisted on a very secular explanation for his script. In the same vein, the revelation stories feature absent interlocutors, which is exactly what literacy delivers. When you read a text, the person who wrote it is communicating with you, but they're typically not present with you in that moment in any embodied way. They may even be dead and they're still communicating with you. So, for example, in the Pawamong story, which I didn't relate, the inventor Shong Lui Yang receives writing from his dead twin sons. But in other stories, perhaps these disembodied visitors are psychologically or metaphorically recalling that experience of dislocated communication. So in line with all of this, I guess there's also an implicit understanding that literacy is not innate. We are not born literate. We acquire it through an intervention. It arrives from the outside like a gift. And I want to mention that these supernatural stories of literacy are not just associated with those who have invented their own writing systems, but there are numerous accounts, for example, of enslaved people in America having dreams in which they learn the Roman alphabet through a divine intervention. And there's at least one Blackfoot story from Canada about a young Native American man gifted with literacy in the Roman alphabet through a vision, through a revelation. Finally, on this point, I was speaking to my colleague Bruce Christensen a few years ago. He's a clinical neuropsychologist, and he mentioned that a common theme in psychotic hallucinations is a story of a visiting stranger who imbues the subject with special gifts. And he also mentioned that hallucinations are experienced by 10 to 12% of the population, often triggered by stress or illness. And interestingly too, the hallucinations are rarely very detailed or fully coherent. You don't get a download of information. So I'd be interested in following up with literature on that. So these are ideas that I'm not super attached to. I just want to put them on the table. I'd be interested in your opinions. So finally, can this tell us anything about the ancient past? Can we use any of this as a kind of ethnographic analogy for understanding folklore from further back in time? This image here, which is reproduced with permission from Latter-day Saints, depicts the story of Joseph Smith, founder of the Mormon Church, having a vision of an angel who gives him gold tablets inscribed in a new writing system, which he then subsequently deciphered to produce the Book of Mormon. And this event is more or less contemporaneous with the story of the Bi-script of Liberia, late 1820s, early 1830s. And in both cases, a book in an unknown script is delivered by a white stranger who has come from God. So this, to me, is something of a recapitulation of the Old Testament narrative of Moses and the Ten Commandments. And in fact, biblical scholars of the 18th century interpreted the Ten Commandments story as an explanation of how writing came to humanity, not just law. There's no mention of writing as writing in that scripture until that point. So we can understand perhaps the appeal of this Judeo-Christian origin story from the Middle East to the US to West Africa. It's influential. But what about elsewhere? So on the Indian subcontinent, there is a story of Tamil writing being gifted to the sage Agastya by Shiva. In Korea, there are stories of the Hangul script being received by the King Sejong as a revelation from heaven. Also a legend of how the king, when he was out at night, he drew some Hangul signs on some large leaves in honey, and then overnight the ants ate the honey on the leaves, leaving behind the script. Perhaps Yulin knows more about this than me. In China, writing is understood to have originated at the hands of Fuxi, China's mythical first emperor, who produced a script inspired by the forms of birds, animals, and elemental forces. And it's possible we can see a kind of reflection of this too in Mesopotamia, where we have Sardanapalus V writing of the cuneiform as a revelation to his royal ancestors from Nabu, while Egypt's Thoth is a considered scribe of the gods. I know less about this literature, I'm afraid, but both these figures are seen to be supernatural, and yet they're also represented as intermediaries or messengers of the gods. Hermes in ancient Greece is sometimes associated with writing for that reason too. Arguably, all these stories posit that writing is not a given property of the world. It is a human intellectual creation, but one that is miraculously inspired or authorized by supernatural agents. And as such, it is seen to hold a relationship with the invisible world. It can summon what is not ostensibly there. So to conclude, there's no big idea here, but if I was to try to synthesize this, I would say writing today is all-pervasive and mundane, yet our traditional stories about it remind us that it is fundamentally a human technology, but one with a miraculous character. And that's all. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions.